Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today we're going to be talking about two weapons that I've made previously, in fact quite a while ago, back in the summer, and we'll do some test cutting, and I'll tell you a bit more information about them after the test cutting if you want to, straight to the action. But yeah, I've got this, a meat cleaver, and I've got this, a machete. Made them myself out of leaf springs, put some ashwood handles in, brass pins, bang bang, done. I'll go into more details after the test cutting. So yeah, good news and bad news. The bad news is, because of the horrible weather, I probably won't have any more test cutting footage. The good news is, while there was still summer, I actually tested these out on camera, which you're about to see now. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. So yeah, with these, to go into more detail, like I said, they were made from a leaf spring. Now, most of the larger sorts of blades that are made have been out of leaf spring material. The only exception being the Sayax, which is made from a large file. So let's go in chronological order. So firstly, I made this meat cleaver. I didn't particularly need one. I mean, we don't have any in our house, but there we go. I actually decided to make a meat cleaver partly because every blade I make, I try not to do what any factory can do and just make the same identical item over and over again. So I wanted to experiment and broaden out. But secondly, in the leaf spring material, there was this. So, see this hole? That means it was, I think it had a bolt going through it, which I cut off with an angle grinder, and it meant that I couldn't do anything, or at least with my current skills and materials and tools, I couldn't really do anything about the hole. So I thought, what can I do? I can't just ignore it, I need to incorporate it like any good blacksmith does. So I thought, I know, meat cleavers often have those holes in them, so they can hook on, I guess, you know, onto a rack or something, since you can't have a massive block-shaped scabbard, or maybe you can, I don't know. So I made a meat cleaver. It went alright. It's got quite a thick and stocky spine. Let me show you close without cutting myself. So here at the base, next to the handle, as you can see, it's full tang. So we go across, and it's not perfectly consistent. And you will also notice, because of the fact that I'm doing this blacksmithing, I have the chance to do things that factories usually can't. There's a lot of geometric design which creates a good quality in some senses, but a lack of imagination in other purposes. So something like a meat cleaver, I see on other blades, it's usually the same kind of thickness all the way along. You know, it can have a consistency, which means it helps with durability because you haven't got particular weak points and stuff that can break. But on the other hand, one of my advantages, which I have deliberately done, is, I'll show you the spine again. Notice at the bottom here, it's a bit narrower, and then especially right towards the tip, it gets thicker. Now that was not an accident. There are some slight wavy lines and, you know, imperfections. Those are by accident. But the fact that I have it thinner towards the, towards the actual tang, which goes into the handle, and thicker at the tip, is a deliberate choice. So I find that with the weight distribution, you can get more chopping power. There's that kind of slicing. So if I, place a blade onto something that I want to cut, and then draw along, the edge geometry and the fine blade and how hard it is can determine the fact that it'll slice things. But if I want to do chopping actions as if I was using an axe, and the meat cleaver kind of compromises, I've always thought of it as halfway between a hatchet and a kitchen knife. It's that halfway house. It does chop, but it does slice. So having it thicker right at the very front end means that, just like a hatchet, for the same weight and not being as, not being too unwieldy by just being bulky and heavy, it actually has more heft for a chopping action. So I've noticed when I'm going into the back garden, I'm experimenting on things like branches and bushes, I can go chop, and because it's got that forward weight to it, as you can see, I'll balance on my finger. It's balanced around here, which is quite good for a knife. And even bearing in mind it's got a thicker handle, I could have made it thinner. So it's got quite a bit of chopping power in it because of the fact that it's got a thicker front end. And the same sort of thing goes in terms of the blade geometry, but I tried to have it tapering down to quite a thin edge. And I have done a similar sort of thing. It's kind of still a fairly fine blade, but it's especially fine at the bottom and focuses more on that razor sharp, it's not literally razor sharp, but that sharp fine edge at the bottom, and a bit less so at the top. So I've actually got a different bevel. It's more, it's more acute at the bottom, so it's more of a gradual taper for that slicing edge right at the bottom, which is why it cuts my hand if I catch it wrong when throwing it, and less so at the tip. Again, it means that if I'm making contact with the blade towards the handle, it slices more. Whereas if I make contact more towards the tip, it chops more. So it doesn't matter where I am, rather than having some blade that does one more or the other more, it kind of does both. So that's that. Anyway, I've talked about it for too long, so we'll go on to this, the Machete. Now this one kind of follows the same principle, but in this case, rather than using the chopping power of the length and the weight, in fact, I think this is actually this is the heavier blade. So bearing in mind, this is actually lighter than the cleaver over there. It does broaden a bit at the tip, but it's not quite as exaggerated. This, I've mostly had weight in the tip going by the breadth, so you'll notice it's narrower here, and that actually makes it smoothly transition into the handle with its curl, which just means it's narrow enough, but it doesn't slip out of the hand, and it's got that curl to kind of stop that from happening. And additionally, well, first let's go back, so it broadens here at the tip, so it gives more weight for that forward heft again, so it's still got a fine edge for slicing, but also a broad tip for chopping, using the breadth rather than the thickness. I wish I'd cut off more material from the leaf spring so I could have made a longer blade, and I maybe could have made it a little bit thinner. Excuse me, but I'm not sure how well I could have flex tempered it, so it's a bit risky. I've also had I did the most squared handle ever. So it's got rounding, so if I give you it this way, you'll also notice the file work. This didn't used to be a saw blade. This is me experimenting with firework before I hardened it. Let's do that. Now you can see that's that on the front of the handle, and here it is on the back. It's a little bit, the fitting actually is a little bit loose at the tip, but it's quite secure the rest of the way down, so I'm quite happy that it's not going to come apart unless someone gets a screwdriver in that top bit and starts trying to open it up. But with that more squared handle, even if I have my eyes closed, it gives a better feeling for the edge alignment. The round handle on the cleaver, I mean, sure, it's okay with the weight and the fact that it's a broad blade, so I can kind of, you know, it wants to roll and drop towards where the correct edge alignment is, so it's not as important with this. But with narrower blades, I find you can't feel the edge alignment as well while you're actively swinging it, and you can end up, you know, that I'm just using the flat. And you can hear, when it does that blowing, that means it's not really good edge alignment, whereas here, if I can make it loud enough, now you can hear it whistling through the air, and it helps having that handle more squared, which means it doesn't want to roll. Even if I slightly hit off angle, it doesn't really want to roll the, you know, the actual blade around inside my hands. It's actually held in place by the structure of my body. And that again is another experiment I did. Both the handles are made from ash wood, grown locally in England, so I don't know what exact variant there are. There are different subspecies, but it's ash wood, so make of that what you will. Varnished with some generic outdoor varnish, and using brass pins to hold it in place. And quenched in rapeseed oil, which is a type of vegetable oil grown here in, you know, quite commonly. You know, sort of slightly a cheaper version of things like sunflower oil and olive oil, since we don't grow olives in here. And sunflowers like the sun, which we don't get much of, so rapeseed is cheap equivalent. Anyway, it means that it produces hardness, if you're used to the Rockwell scale, usually in the mid-50s range, so that means if I do well enough, I can get a fairly consistent quench. I just need to practice tempering so I can get that flexibility in the blades, which is one reason why this is so short. So anyway, that's enough of that. Thank you for watching, and have a good day, people.